2.5 miles beneath the North Atlantic lies a ship that no human eye saw for 73 years. Her bow stands upright in the mud, buried to the anchors, still facing west. Her stern lies torn apart, more than 1/3 of a mile away, and yet no ship in history has been seen more, imagined more, argued about more. This is the entire story of Titanic, not just the night she sank, but the world that built her, the people who boarded her, and the certainty that went down with her. Because Titanic was never only a ship, she was an entire age cast in steel, a floating palace where millionaires and emigrants crossed the same ocean, decks apart, toward the same dark water. When she went down, she took some 1,500 lives. She also took something harder to count, an era's faith that progress itself could keep people safe. The story does not begin on the ocean. It begins with a race across the Atlantic, and a company that already knew it could not win. Chapter 1. The Race Across the Atlantic. To understand why Titanic existed at all, you have to understand what the North Atlantic was in the first years of the 20th century. It was not simply an ocean. It was the busiest and most valuable sea route on Earth, the highway between the old world and the new. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people crossed it. Wealthy Americans sailed east to tour Europe. European emigrants sailed west to start new lives. Mail, cargo, business, and ambition all moved across that cold grey water. And the companies that carried them were locked in a competition as fierce as any in the history of business. Two names towered above the rest: Cunard and White Star. Both British, both proud, both watching each other constantly. In 1907, Cunard changed the game. That year, the company put two extraordinary new ships into service: Lusitania and Mauretania. They were the largest vessels in the world at the time. And more importantly, they were the fastest. Lusitania took the blue riband, the unofficial trophy for the fastest Atlantic crossing, and her sister Mauretania soon took it from her and held it for more than 2 decades. Nothing else on the ocean could touch them. But there is a detail behind those famous ships that most tellings leave out. And it matters. Cunard did not build them alone. The British government had loaned the company roughly £2.6 million on generous terms, and paid an annual subsidy on top of it, on the condition that the ships could be converted into armed cruisers if war ever came. None of this was secret. It was debated in Parliament and reported in the newspapers of the day. In other words, the fastest ships on the Atlantic were partly instruments of national policy. Britain wanted the speed record flying a British flag, and Britain paid for it. White Star had no such backing, and that fact shaped everything that followed. Because White Star, by 1907, was not exactly a British company anymore. 5 years earlier, it had been purchased by the International Mercantile Marine Company, a vast shipping trust assembled by the American financier J.P. Morgan. Morgan was, by most measures, the most powerful banker on Earth. He had organized United States Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. And he had decided that the Atlantic passenger trade should be organized the same way: consolidated, controlled, and profitable. White Star kept its British flag, its British crews, and its British character, but the money behind it was American, and the money expected returns. So picture the problem facing J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line. He was the son of the company's founder, and tall, reserved, sometimes difficult man who had inherited both a business and a legacy. His great rival had just launched the 2 fastest ships ever built. With government help, he could not match. Chasing them on speed would mean enormous engines, enormous coal bills, and a race White Star would probably lose anyway. Ismay's answer became one of the most consequential business decisions of the 20th century. If White Star could not win the speed game, it would refuse to play it. It would compete on something else entirely. Caesar, comfort, luxury. Ismay's ships would cross the Atlantic a day slower than Cunard's greyhounds. And they would make that slowness feel like a privilege, a crossing not to be endured, but to be enjoyed. The story goes that the plan took shape one evening in the summer of 1907, at a dinner in the London mansion of Lord Pirrie, chairman of the Belfast shipbuilding firm Harland and Wolff. Over dinner, Ismay and Pirrie are said to have sketched a vision of not one ship, but 3 sisters, each larger than anything afloat. Honesty requires a note here. No written record of that dinner survives. No menu, no minutes, no diary entry. The story comes from later accounts and company tradition, and historians generally treat its broad outline as credible while admitting the details are lost. What is documented beyond any doubt is what came next. Within a year, Harland and Wolff was preparing to build the largest moving objects ever made by human hands. The relationship between the two companies was itself remarkable, and it tells you how this era did business. Harland and Wolff built White Star's ships on what was known as a cost-plus arrangement. The yard spent whatever was necessary and added a fixed percentage as profit. Think about what that means. There was no incentive to cut corners, and no hard ceiling on ambition. When White Star asked for the biggest ships in the world, the yard's answer was not whether, but how. 3 ships. The first would be called Olympic, the second, Titanic. The third would eventually sail as Britannic. The names alone tell you what these vessels were meant to say to the world. They were named for gods, for giants, for empire. This was not transportation. This was a statement. And this is why the story starts here, in boardrooms and dinner parties, rather than at a shipyard. We remember Titanic as a triumph of engineering that failed. But she did not begin as an engineering dream. She began as a market position. She was the answer to a competitor's advantage, shaped by a banker's trust in New York, a subsidy in London, and a chairman in Liverpool who needed an edge. The men who conceived her were not asking, "What is the safest ship we can build?" They were asking, "What ship will win back the Atlantic?" That is not a condemnation. It is simply the truth of how great things get built, then and now. But it explains so much of what comes later. The size of the ship, the layout of her decks, the number of her lifeboats, the schedule she sailed under. All of it traces back, one way or another, to the logic of that race. A race for passengers, for prestige, and for profit, on an ocean that everyone involved believed had already been tamed. They believed it because the evidence seemed overwhelming. By 1907, the great steamship lines had been crossing the Atlantic for decades with a safety record that looked, to the public, close to perfect. Serious disasters had grown rare. Hulls had become steel. Ships had grown huge. And wireless telegraphy meant a vessel in trouble was no longer alone on an empty sea. A whole generation had come of age believing that the ocean crossing, once a genuine gamble with death, had become as routine as a train journey. That belief was the true keel of Titanic. It was laid down before any steel was cut. In Belfast, on the other side of the Irish Sea, an army of workers was about to find out what that belief would ask of them. Someone still had to build the giant, and building her would be one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. Chapter 2. Belfast. Where the giant was born. Every legend has an address. Titanic's was Queen's Island. Belfast. A stretch of reclaimed mud on the east bank of the River Lagan, where the shipyard of Harland and Wolff had spent half a century turning iron and steel into the merchant fleet of the British Empire. Belfast at the start of the 20th century was not a quaint Irish town. It was one of the great industrial engines of the world. It spun more linen than any city on earth. It was home to one of the largest ropeworks in existence. And at the bottom of the hill, past the rows of terraced brick houses, it built ships. Roughly 15,000 men and boys walked through the gates of Harland and Wolff every working morning. In many streets, the shipyard was not a place people worked. It was the reason the street existed. To build the new giants, the yard first had to rebuild itself. 3 existing slipways were torn out and replaced with 2 enormous ones. And over them rose a structure that changed the Belfast skyline. A great gantry built by the firm of Sir William Arrol, the same company that had built the Forth Bridge in Scotland. It stood roughly 220 feet high, a cage of steel with cranes and elevators and walkways. And it existed for one purpose: to let 2 of the largest objects in human history grow inside it side by side. Olympic came first. Her keel, laid in December of 1908. Titanic followed on the 31st of March, 1909. In the yard's ledgers, she was simply hull number 401. For the next 2 years, that hull climbed into the sky, one steel plate at a time. And here the story has to look past the machinery and see the hands. Because Titanic was not really built by machines. She was built by squads of men driving rivets. Roughly 3 million of them in the hull alone. A riveting squad was a small team with a brutal rhythm. A boy heated each rivet in a coal furnace until it glowed, then threw it to a catcher, who seized it with tongs and set it in the hole. One man held it in place. On the other side of the plate, riveters hammered it flat, blow after blow, thousands of times a day. The squads were paid by the rivet, not by the hour, which tells you everything about the pace. Many older riveters went partly deaf from the noise. In Belfast, the condition was so common it had a nickname. People simply called it Belfast ear. The work was dangerous in ways that were considered ordinary at the time. Men climbed wooden staging, hundreds of feet up, with no harnesses. Plates and tools fell. A grim saying long associated with the shipbuilding trade held that a yard could expect roughly 1 death for every £100,000 spent, and whether or not anyone kept such accounts formally, the men on the staging understood the arithmetic it described. The commonly cited record for Titanic is 8 men killed during her construction, with hundreds more injured. And the first of the dead is worth naming. Samuel Scott was a catch boy who fell from staging beside the hull in April of 1910. He was 15 years old. For almost a century he lay in an unmarked grave in Belfast City Cemetery, until a headstone was finally placed there in 2011. If you want to know what the floating palace actually cost, it was not paid in first class. It was paid by boys like him, working for a fraction of the couple of pounds a week that the skilled men around him earned. Above this world of noise and risk moved one man who belonged to both the drawing office and the deck plates. Thomas Andrews was the managing director in charge of design, a nephew of the yard's chairman, Lord Pirrie, and by every surviving account, one of the most genuinely liked men in Belfast. Workers who might have resented a boss's nephew instead trusted him, because he was everywhere, in the double bottom, in the boiler rooms, up on the staging, notebook in hand, recording every flaw he could find. Colleagues later recalled that he knew the ship. In the phrase of the time, as a mother knows her child, Titanic was, as much as any single person's, his. He would sail on her too. On the 31st of May, 1911, a crowd reported in the press at around 100,000 people. close to a third of the city, gathered to watch Hull 401 touch water. There was no champagne and no christening ceremony. White Star simply did not do them. The yard's own saying was that they just built the ships and shoved them in. 22 tons of tallow, swap, and oil greased the slipway. A rocket fired. And, 62 seconds later, Titanic was afloat. The crowd cheered a triumph. What most of them did not know was that even this day had a price. A shipwright named James Dobbin was crushed by falling timber shores during the launch preparations and died of his injuries shortly after. On her proudest day in Belfast, the ship took a life. She was afloat, but she was hollow, an empty steel shell. Now came 10 more months of fitting out, and the transformation of a hull into a palace. That palace deserves a chapter of its own, because every deck of it was a map of exactly who the world of 1912 believed people were, and what it believed they were worth. Chapter 3. The Floating Palace. Start with the numbers, because in 1912, the numbers themselves were the advertisement. Titanic measured roughly 882 feet in length, about 92 feet across, and just over 46,000 gross tons, a measure of enclosed volume rather than weight, which made her, by a narrow margin over her own sister, the largest moving object human beings had ever made. Stand her on her stern beside the buildings of her era, and she would have out-towered almost every skyscraper in New York. Her rudder alone weighed as much as a small ship. Each link of her anchor chain weighed more than a grown man. 29 boilers fed her engines. 2 massive reciprocating engines turned the outer propellers, and a turbine, running on their exhaust steam, turned the center one. Top speed, around 23 knots. Mauritania could do 26. White Star was not chasing her, and never intended to. The engineering ambition lived elsewhere. It lived, above all, in the safety systems. And here the story has to be precise, because here the legend was born. The hull was divided by 15 transverse bulkheads into 16 watertight compartments. The lower doors between them could be closed from the bridge with an electric switch. The ship was designed to float with any 2 compartments flooded. And even with the first 4 gone, a standard far beyond what any ordinary collision was expected to inflict. This was genuinely advanced design, and naval architects admired it. But notice what happened between the drawing office and the public mind. The trade journal, The Shipbuilder, reviewing the new sisters in 1911, wrote that with the watertight doors closed, the vessel was practically unsinkable. Practically, a careful engineering word, meaning under any accident, the profession considered realistic. How widely the public believed the bolder version before she sailed is genuinely hard to measure, and historians differ on it. What is not in doubt is what happened afterward. The qualification was easy to shorten, and after the sinking it was shortened permanently, until the word that survived in the world's memory was simply unsinkable. No engineer at Harland and Wolff ever claimed that, and no serious document from the yard says it. The myth was not built in Belfast. It grew in the space between what experts said and what everyone heard. And in this story, that space is the iceberg before the iceberg. There was one more marvel aboard, and it sat in a small room on the boat deck. The Marconi wireless installation was among the most powerful afloat, with a guaranteed range of several hundred miles by day and far more at night. Its 2 young operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were employed not by White Star, but by the Marconi company itself. And that detail matters. Their commercial job, the work that paid, was sending personal telegrams for wealthy passengers at premium rates. Ice warnings from other ships shared the same single wireless channel with millionaires' dinner arrangements. On the night of the 14th of April, that arrangement would become fatal. Now walk the decks, because the ship herself was a portrait of her age. In first class, the famous grand staircase descended beneath a dome of iron and glass. There was a heated swimming pool, one of the first on any liner, a Turkish bath, a gymnasium with an electric camel, a squash court, and the Café Parisien, got up like a French sidewalk café with real ivy on the trellises. The finest suites came with private promenade decks. And in high season, one of those suites cost around £870 for a single crossing, at a time when a Belfast shipyard man might earn a couple of pounds a week. Run that arithmetic. Years of a shipbuilder's wages. For 6 days at sea, second class on Titanic was, by broad agreement among historians of the period, equal to first class on many rival liners. Comfortable cabins, a fine dining saloon, a library, teachers, clergymen, engineers, shopkeepers, the respectable middle of the world. And third class is where the story usually gets told wrong. So let us tell it right. Third class on Titanic was not the reeking open steerage of the 1880s. There were real cabins, mostly for 2 to 10 people. A dining saloon with waiters serving plain hot food. And for many emigrants aboard, more comfort than they had ever known on land. A ticket cost around £7 or £8. White Star was competing hard for the emigrant trade, because emigrants, in aggregate, were the steady money. The classes were separated by gates and barriers, and the truth about those barriers needs its full context. The separation reflected United States immigration and public health requirements, as well as the liner's own class system. Because steerage passengers faced inspection on arrival in America, and the shipping lines organized their vessels accordingly. On an ordinary crossing, the gates were simply how the world was arranged. On one particular night, they would become part of something else. Which brings us to the 20 objects on the boat deck that this entire story bends around. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, 14 standard boats, 2 cutters, and 4 collapsibles, with a total capacity of 1,178 people. She was certified to carry more than 3,300. And now the fact that surprises almost everyone. This was completely legal. British Board of Trade regulations. Written decades earlier and never updated. Scaled lifeboats to tonnage, not to people, and stopped counting at 10,000 tons. By the letter of the law, Titanic actually exceeded her requirements. Her davits were a modern design with capacity to serve additional boats. And Alexander Carlisle, the yard's former general manager who had worked on the early plans, later testified at the British inquiry that he had prepared arrangements capable of carrying considerably more boats before the number settled at 20. Why carry more than the law demands? On a practically unsinkable ship, at the cost of deck space for the passengers who paid the bills. Almost no one in 1912 found that question alarming. That is the point of this chapter. Every part of her, the compartments, the gates, the wireless, the 20 boats, made perfect sense inside the logic of her age. The palace was finished. Now it needed people. And the people who walked up her gangways in April of 1912 were about to turn a ship into a world. Chapter 4. The people who came aboard. A ship is steel until people walk into her. In the first days of April, 1912, more than 2,000 of them were converging on the port of Southampton. And if you want to understand what Titanic really was, do not look at her hull. Look at her passenger list. For 6 days, this one vessel would carry a nearly complete cross-section of the Western world, arranged deck by deck, from the very top of society to the people that society barely counted. But first, understand the city she sailed from. Because Southampton, in April of 1912, was a place holding its breath. Britain had just come through a national coal strike that idled mines for weeks and choked the shipping trade. Sailings were cancelled across the board. Liners sat cold at their berths. And in a port city where the sea paid most of the wages, families were going hungry. White Star scraped together coal for Titanic by emptying the bunkers of other ships in the harbour, and some of her passengers were transfers from cancelled crossings. So when the White Star office opened, hiring for the new ship, men queued for the chance. Roughly 900 crew signed on, and by the count presented at the British inquiry afterward, the overwhelming majority gave Southampton addresses. Stokers, stewards, cooks, seamen, for their streets. Titanic was not a legend. She was the first good news in months. When this story ends, the grief will not be spread evenly across the world. It will be concentrated, house by house, in a few square miles of one English port town. Commanding them was the most famous merchant captain alive, Edward John Smith, 62 years old, white-bearded, calm, the very image of what a captain was supposed to be. He had commanded White Star's finest ships for years, and wealthy regulars crossed the Atlantic specifically with him, which is why the newspapers called him the millionaire's captain. This crossing was widely reported to be near the end of his long career, and Smith had said something, years earlier, that history has never let go. In a newspaper interview published in 1907, after he brought the liner Adriatic to New York, he was quoted as saying that he could not imagine any condition that would cause a modern ship to founder. That shipbuilding had gone beyond that. He was not boasting. He was summarizing what nearly every professional seaman of his generation believed. After decades in which the North Atlantic passenger trade had grown steadily safer, this story is, among other things, the biography of that sentence. Now, the passengers. And start at the top, because the top of this list was the top of the world. John Jacob Astor IV was reputed to be one of the richest men on earth, heir to a real estate empire that owned great stretches of New York, builder of famous hotels. He came aboard trailing scandal. He had divorced, then married Madeline Force, a girl of 18, younger than his own son. And the outrage in society had been loud enough that the couple had waited out the storm abroad. Now, Madeline was pregnant, and they were going home. Benjamin Guggenheim, of the mining and smelting fortune, was aboard with his valet and his chauffeur, traveling with a French singer who was not his wife. Isidore Strauss, co-owner of Macy's department store in New York and a former congressman, was returning with Ida, his wife of more than 4 decades. Fellow passengers would later describe the two of them walking the decks arm in arm, a couple famously devoted after a lifetime together. And there was Margaret Brown of Denver, a self-made mining fortune behind her, loud, warm, unfashionable among the old money set, and about to become one of the most famous women in America. History would rename her Molly. The people who actually knew her called her Margaret. There were others whose presence tells you what this crossing meant. Archibald Butt, military aide and close confidant to President Taft. Heading home from a European rest, W.T. Stead, one of the most famous journalists in Britain, sailing to speak at a peace congress in New York at the president's invitation. Add the artists, the tennis players, the industrialists, and first class on Titanic held, by the estimates printed in the papers of the day, a combined fortune in the hundreds of millions of dollars. At 1912 values, one deck of one ship, and J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the line, occupying one of the finest suites, crossing, as he often did on a maiden voyage, part passenger, part owner, a man whose exact role aboard would later be argued over in two separate investigations. Travelling in his own cabin, with a small party from Belfast, was Thomas Andrews, aboard, as he always was, on a new ship, notebook in hand, watching for the 100 small things that only the man who designed her would notice. Below them, second class, and if you want the honest texture of 1912, it is here. Teachers, ministers, engineers, shopkeepers, a science teacher named Lawrence Beasley, whose written account would become one of our clearest windows into the voyage. Respectable people in a respectable middle, sailing on a ship where their accommodations equaled first class on older liners, and quietly proud of it. And then third class, more than 700 people, and here the ship becomes something no palace ever was. Down on the lower decks, Titanic was an emigrant ship, and her manifest read like a map of everywhere hope was thin. Irish farm families, Swedes and Finns heading for the upper Midwest, Lebanese and Syrian villages, whole clusters of them from the same few towns, Croatians, Bulgarians, Armenians, entire families travelling together. And one of them, this story will follow all the way to the end. Frederick Goodwin was an electrical engineer from Fulham, in London, a man in his early 40s. His brother had gone ahead to America and written home about work waiting at the great power station at Niagara Falls. So Frederick and his wife Augusta sold up and booked passage for the whole family. 6 children, from 16-year-old Lillian down to Sydney, 19 months old. They had been booked on a smaller steamer, and when the coal strike cancelled that sailing, the family was transferred, along with many others, to the new ship everyone was talking about. 8 Goodwins walked up the third-class gangway at Southampton. For families like theirs, the £7 or £8 tickets were not a purchase. They were the accumulated savings of years, converted into a single one-way bet that life could be different in America. So hold the whole ship in your mind at once, the way almost no one aboard ever could. On the top decks, people crossing for pleasure, for business, for the season. In the middle, people crossing for careers and family. Below the waterline of society, people crossing to be reborn. 3 different Americas were sailing on one hull. The America you tour, the America you work in, and the America you dream about. They would share the same ocean, the same weather, the same iceberg. What they would not share, as the numbers will show when we reach the end of this story, was the same chance of surviving it. On the morning of the 10th of April, the boat train came down from London. The gangways filled, and at noon, 3 whistle blasts rolled across Southampton water. The maiden voyage had begun. It was very nearly over 4 minutes later. Chapter 5. 4 quiet days. Titanic's first brush with disaster came before she cleared her own harbour, and almost nobody remembers it, which is a shame, because it is a perfect miniature of this entire story. As she moved down the narrow channel, she passed 2 liners, moored side by side, idled by the coal strike. One of them was the American liner New York, and as Titanic's enormous hull pushed past, the water between the ships did something the age of smaller vessels had never taught anyone to expect. The sheer volume of moving water created suction. The New York's mooring lines tightened, strained, and then snapped, the cracks reportedly sounding like gunshots. And her stern began swinging out, drawn helplessly toward the new giant. Passengers lining Titanic's rails watched the gap close to a few feet, a collision on the maiden voyage. In the first hour, in the home port, it did not happen. A harbour tug got a line on the New York. Captain Smith worked his engines. By survivor and press accounts, using a burst of wash from a propeller to push the drifting ship clear. And the two hulls never touched. The departure was delayed about an hour, and the moment passed into small talk. But notice what had actually happened. The ship was so large that she changed the physics of the water around her, in ways that experienced seamen did not fully anticipate. Some passengers, Beasley among them, later wrote that a few aboard read the near miss as a bad omen. That is hindsight talking. And this story does not deal in omens. The practical lesson available that morning was different. Titanic's sheer scale made the familiar unfamiliar. The rules of seamanship everyone knew had been written for smaller ships. That lesson was there for the taking on day one. At walking speed, in calm water, it went unlearned and sailed on with her. That evening she anchored off Cherbourg, on the French coast, too large for the harbour itself, and two purpose-built tenders ferried passengers out, the Astors among them. The next day, the 11th of April, she anchored again, off Queenstown in Ireland, the emigrant gateway of the Irish Atlantic, where more than 100 third-class passengers came aboard. It is from Queenstown that we have some of the last photographs of the ship ever taken. Because a young Irish Jesuit in training, named Francis Brown, a keen amateur photographer who had sailed just the Southampton to Queenstown leg, walked down the gangway with his camera full. And there are survivor accounts that as the ship weighed anchor, a young Irish emigrant named Eugene Daly stood on deck playing the pipes. An old air his fellow passengers remembered as a farewell to Ireland. Then the tenders fell away. The coast of Kerry slid past, and Titanic turned her bow toward open ocean. By one widely used modern count, about 2,200 people were aboard. Contemporary records differ slightly on the exact total, because the passenger and crew lists of 1912 were never perfectly reconciled, and this story will say about 2,200, and mean every one of them. What followed were 4 of the calmest, most pleasant days anyone aboard could remember at sea, and this chapter will not rush them, because everything that happens later happened to these people. In the middle of this ordinariness, the ship settled into her rhythms, and the rhythms were the class system with a daily schedule. In first class, the day moved from the gymnasium in the morning to lunch, to promenading, to the ritual of dressing for dinner, to coffee and cigars, bridge in the lounge, the orchestra playing. In second class, much the same at a gentler price. Books from the library, hymns on Sunday evening. In third class, something looser and in its own way happier. Crowded common rooms, card games, a piano, dancing in the general room at night. Dozens of languages negotiating with each other. Among the families in those crowded third-class spaces were the Goodwins. 8 of them, the youngest, only 19 months old. Survivor accounts across all 3 classes agree on the essentials of those days. The ship barely seemed to move. The food was better than expected. The weather held clear and grew steadily colder. Up in the working ship, the maiden voyage was also, quietly, a trial run. More boilers were brought online as the days passed, and the daily mileage runs posted for the passengers climbed steadily, from 386 miles to 519 to 546. Passengers bet small sums on the next day's figure. There is survivor testimony, including accounts touching on conversations with Ismay, suggesting talk aboard of working the ship up to full speed later in the voyage. a point both investigations would probe hard. What the record shows plainly is this. Titanic was not racing for any record. She was never built to. She was simply doing what every crackliner did on the North Atlantic run. Keeping schedule. At speed. In fine weather. Exactly as the practice of the era prescribed. And the era's practice had one more feature. The ice reports were already arriving. They came in by wireless as the ship steamed west. From vessels ahead on the track. Reporting field ice, bergs, and growlers drifting further south this season than usual. Into the very lanes the liners used. The messages were routine paperwork of the North Atlantic spring. Some reached the bridge and were posted or noted. Officers adjusted their expectations of when, not whether, they might see ice. Nothing about this alarmed anyone. And by the standards of 1912 seamanship, nothing about it should have. Ships had steamed through ice reports for decades. You kept your speed. You trusted your lookouts. And you altered course when you saw something. That was the profession. One more thread. And then the night comes. Late on Saturday, the 12th into the 13th of April. The Marconi set broke down. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked through the night. Off the clock. And repaired it themselves rather than lose days of paying traffic. By Sunday morning, the wireless was working again. And a backlog of passengers' personal telegrams had piled up. All of them waiting to be sent. At premium rates. Through the single channel that also carried the ice reports. Sunday, the 14th of April, dawned bright, calm, and cold. It was going to be the last full day, and it came with 6 warnings. Chapter 6, Sunday, the 14th of April. 6 warnings. If you could relive one day of this story standing on the bridge, it would be this one. Not the night. The day. The night was fast and chaotic. But the day was slow, ordinary, and full of information. Enough information to justify far greater caution arrived on board during this one Sunday. Piece by piece. In plain English. This chapter is the story of what happened to it. A note on the count before we begin. Historians tally the ice messages of that day differently, depending on which ships and which relays are included. This chapter follows the 6 warnings most directly connected to Titanic on the 14th of April, as the investigations reconstructed them from logs and testimony. The day began cold and brilliant. Church services were held in all 3 classes in the morning. Captain Smith himself leading the first-class service. The sea stayed unusually calm, and the temperature kept falling, dropping toward freezing as the afternoon wore on. Cold enough that passengers abandoned the open decks early. Old sailors knew what that kind of cold in April on this track could mean. The ship was approaching the region where the Labrador Current carries ice down from Greenland into the shipping lanes. Take the warnings in order. At about 9 in the morning, the Cunard liner Caronia reported bergs, growlers, and field ice near the very longitude Titanic would cross that night. This message reached Captain Smith, and it was posted for the officers. Routine, professional, acknowledged. In the early afternoon, around 1:40, came a report from the White Star liner Baltic. Ice on the steamer track. Smith read it, and then he did something small that would look deeply troubling in the record afterward. Meeting J. Bruce Ismay on deck. The captain handed him the message, and Ismay put it in his pocket and carried it around for hours, later showing it to passengers. According to testimony, before Smith asked for it back in the evening so it could be posted in the chart room. A piece of navigational safety information spent the afternoon as a conversation piece. At almost the same time, a message from the German liner America reporting large icebergs passed through Titanic's wireless room for relay onward. and the evidence before the British investigation indicated it was never delivered to the bridge at all. Smith was not ignoring the ice. At about 5:50 that evening, Titanic made her westward turn, and she made it a little later than some officers expected, which put her track somewhat south of the most direct line. Whether that represented a deliberate attempt to give the reported ice a wider berth, or simply reflected the customary practice of the route, is still debated. And the captain did not live to say, what he did not do is the part beyond dispute. He did not reduce speed, and by the universal custom of the North Atlantic in 1912, few captains would have clear night, sharp lookouts, full speed. The British investigation itself later confirmed that this was standard practice at the time, followed by the most experienced masters of every line. Save your anger at Smith and aim it wider. The entire industry had been running this exact gamble for decades, and winning, and every safe arrival had made the gamble look more like a law of nature. At 7:30 in the evening, Titanic's wireless picked up a message from a small cargo and passenger steamer called the Californian, reporting 3 large bergs about 50 miles ahead of Titanic's position. It reached the bridge. The name Californian will haunt the rest of this story. Around 9 that night, Second Officer Charles Lightoller and Captain Smith stood together on the bridge, and their conversation, recounted by Lightoller under oath, is one of the most quietly chilling exchanges in maritime history. They discussed the extraordinary conditions. No moon, no wind, a sea so flat it looked like polished glass, and they agreed on the problem this created. On a normal night, you spot a berg at distance by the white foam of waves breaking at its base. On a dead calm night, there is no foam. Even so, both men believed there would be light enough to see ice in time. Smith retired with an instruction Lightoller quoted afterward. If it becomes at all doubtful, let me know at once. Then the captain went to bed. Up in the crow's nest, lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were watching that flat black sea with their naked eyes. The pair of binoculars intended for the crow's nest could not be found. The lookouts had asked about glasses back in Southampton and had been told there were none available for them. A fact both investigations confirmed. Whether binoculars would have changed anything is genuinely debated. And Fleet himself would only say he might have seen the berg a little sooner. But the detail stands for something larger. On the finest ship ever built, with a heated swimming pool and a French cafe, the 2 men guarding 2,200 lives were missing a piece of equipment worth a few pounds. At 9:40, the steamer Mesaba sent Titanic a warning that historians regard as the most important single message of the night, reporting heavy pack ice and great numbers of large icebergs in a stretch of ocean lying directly across Titanic's course. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips was buried in the backlog of passenger telegrams to the shore station at Cape Race. The paying traffic that had piled up during the breakdown. The Mesaba message carried no captain's prefix that would have forced it to the bridge. The evidence indicates it was set aside and never delivered. The ice it described lay across the water Titanic was steaming into. And then, at about 11, the Californian again. She had run into the ice field and stopped for the night, and her operator called Titanic to say so. He was so close that his signal blasted into Phillips's headphones over the faint Cape Race traffic. And Phillips, exhausted and swamped, snapped back a phrase that has been quoted ever since, telling him to shut up, that he was busy, that he was working Cape Race. A word of fairness here. In the clipped working language of wireless operators, that phrase was less extraordinary than it sounds to modern ears, closer to shorthand than to insult, and operators of the era used it routinely. What mattered was not the tone but the consequence. The Californian's lone operator listened a while longer, then switched off his set and went to bed. It was about 11:30. 6 warnings across one day. And look at how they died. 1 posted. 1 in a chairman's pocket for an afternoon. 1 never delivered to the bridge. 1 noted. 1 buried under paying traffic. 1 brushed aside. No villain anywhere. And that is the terrible elegance of it. A captain, following the standard practice of his whole profession. Operators, doing the job they were actually paid to do. Lookouts without glasses, doing their best. No single act created what was coming. A chain of ordinary decisions did. Each man performing the role he understood, while the design of the whole thing quietly failed. At 22.5 knots, on a moonless night, toward ice that had been described to that ship by name and by position 6 separate times. The temperature of the sea was now around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Below the freezing point of fresh water, in the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee stared into a darkness with no horizon line. The black water and black sky, sewn together without a seam. Somewhere ahead, invisible, a mass of ice, most of its bulk below the surface, lay directly on the line the ship was drawing across the ocean. It was 11:39 at night. Chapter 7. 11:40. The Iceberg. Frederick Fleet saw it first as an absence. A patch of night, slightly darker than the night around it. Small, then not small. Dead ahead and growing. He struck the crow's nest bell 3 times. The signal for an object directly ahead. Then, grabbed the telephone to the bridge. 6th Officer James Moody answered. Fleet's words, repeated under oath on 2 continents, were 4. Iceberg, right ahead. What happened next took less time than it will take to describe. 1st Officer William Murdoch, the officer of the watch, was already reacting, and testimony suggests he may have seen the berg himself at nearly the same moment. He called hard a starboard, which in the tiller commands of 1912 meant swing the bow to port. To the left, he reached the engine room telegraphs and rang down an order. 4th Officer Boxhall recalled it as full speed astern. Though historians still debate exactly what was rung and how far the engine room got in answering it in the time available. And Murdoch threw the switch that closed the watertight doors down in the belly of the ship, sending stokers scrambling through the closing frames. Then everyone on the bridge did the only thing left. They watched. A ship that size, at 22.5 knots, does not respond like a motor car. For long seconds, the bow refused to move, and the berg came on. And then, slowly, the bow began to swing left. How long did the whole thing take? From sighting to impact. 1 later reconstruction, built from the testimony about distances and speed, places the interval at roughly 37 seconds. And that figure has become famous. But the honest statement is simpler and colder. Less than a minute separated the warning from the impact. And in that minute, the ship turned, perhaps 2 points. It was almost enough. That is the word that has tormented every student of this night for over a century. Almost. The berg did not hit the bow head-on. It scraped down the starboard side, below the waterline, a grinding, glancing blow along the forward third of the hull, up in the crow's nest. Fleet watched it slide past, so close that ice broke off and crashed onto the forward well deck. Tons of it, scattering across the planking where, within minutes, some third-class passengers would come up and playfully kick chunks of it around. Here is what the impact felt like, drawn from survivor accounts across the ship, and the answer is the most unsettling thing in this chapter. Almost nothing. In the first-class lounge, card players felt a faint, grinding shudder. Lie Toller, in his bunk, felt a vibration, and knew something had touched. But many passengers slept straight through it. A few, closest to the bow, heard a tearing, scraping noise. Down in Boiler Room 6, it was another world entirely. A bang. The starboard side seeming to open. The sea bursting in as the alarm sounded, and the watertight doors came sliding down. But for most of the roughly 2,200 people aboard, the most consequential moment of their lives registered as a tremble in a water glass. If it registered at all. On the bridge, Captain Smith was there within moments, asking Murdoch what the ship had struck. The engines were stopped. The ship lay still on the flat black sea, her lights blazing, faintly hissing steam, and for a little while the night pretended nothing had happened. The truth was below, and it was arithmetic. The Iceberg had not slashed one long gash, as legend later drew it. The naval architect Edward Wilding of Harland and Wolff, working from the flooding evidence at the British investigation, calculated something stranger and worse. A series of intermittent openings, buckled plates, sprungseams, popped rivets, scattered along nearly 300 feet of the forward hull, with a combined area of only about 12 square feet. 12 square feet, roughly the size of a household door lying on its side. That was the entire wound that sank the largest ship in the world. But it was distributed across 6 watertight compartments: the forepeak, the 3 forward holds, and boiler rooms 6 and 5. And the sea does not care how small a wound is, only where it is. Thomas Andrews knew the ship as a mother knows her child. Now Smith sent for him, and together, and separately with officers, they went down into her. The mail room, 24 feet above the keel, already drowning. Clerks dragging sodden registered mail sacks up companionways, water swirling over the plating in the forward holds. The squash court flooding. Andrews ran the numbers in his head against the design he had lived inside for years. The ship could float with any 2 compartments flooded. She could float with the first 4 gone. She had not been designed to survive flooding across 6. And the compartments had one feature that now became the whole story. The watertight bulkheads did not run all the way up. They rose only a few decks. Because no accident anyone had planned for required more. As the flooded bow pulled the ship down at the head, water in each compartment would rise to the top of its bulkhead and spill over into the next, like water filling an ice cube tray tipped at one end. Compartment by compartment, front to back. It was not a possibility. It was a sequence. Andrews gave Smith his verdict in the privacy of the bridge, and the officers who learned it carried it like a stone. The ship was going to sink. Not might. Would. It was. In the phrasing attributed to Andrews in survivor accounts. A mathematical certainty. He gave her an hour and a half. Perhaps 2. Now run the other arithmetic. The one Smith was running in the same moment. About 2,200 people aboard. Lifeboat seats for 1,178. The nearest ship answering wireless was hours away. The water was 28 degrees, and far below the boat deck, in the third-class accommodation forward, were families like the Goodwins. 8 people in a maze of corridors they had lived in for exactly 4 days. At 5 minutes past midnight, Captain Smith gave the order to uncover the lifeboats. The Palace had roughly 2 hours left to live. And now comes the question this entire story has been building toward. Not why did the ship sink. Ships sink. The question of Titanic is what happened on her decks in those 2 hours. When a floating cross-section of Western civilization discovered that there were not enough seats, and had to decide, family by family, class by class, minute by minute, who was going to live. Chapter 8. The Mathematics of Survival. Begin this chapter with the number, because every scene that follows happens inside it. 1,178 seats. About 2,200 people. Even if every boat left the ship loaded to its rated capacity, and not one of them would. Roughly 1,000 people were already condemned before the first davit swung out. What happened on Titanic's boat deck between midnight and 2:20 was not a rescue. It was a distribution. And how those seats were distributed is among the most revealing 2 hours in the social history of the 20th century. Understand first why the deck did not look like panic. For a long while it looked like confusion and reluctance. The ship stood huge, brilliant with light, apparently solid, listing so gently at first that many passengers refused to believe anything serious had happened. The night air stood at freezing. The boats were small, hung some 60 feet above black water, lowered by hand on ropes. Passengers were being asked to trade a warm, lit, wounded but floating palace for a rowboat on the dark North Atlantic. Many looked at that trade and said no, thank you. Some went back inside to the warmth, and no general alarm system as we would understand one existed. No sirens, no public address. The news travelled at the speed of stewards knocking on doors, and it travelled differently on different decks. That difference is this chapter. At 12:45, the first boat away. Number 7, on the starboard side, left with about 28 people aboard. Its capacity was 65. Sit with that for a moment. In the most famous lifeboat shortage in history, the first boat left more than half empty. So did others. Boat 1, an emergency cutter rated for 40, went down the falls with 12. 5 passengers and 7 crew. A boat that would generate scandal for years afterward. The reasons were layered. Some officers doubted whether the boats could safely be lowered, fully loaded, and meant to fill them from the water. Passengers hung back, and the crew had never run a proper boat drill together. One had actually been scheduled for that very Sunday morning, and was cancelled. No convincing reason why ever emerged in the testimony. Now the phrase everyone knows. Women and children first. And the fact almost nobody knows about it. It was not a law. It was written in no regulation. It was a custom of the sea. And on Titanic, that custom was interpreted 2 different ways on the 2 sides of the same deck. At the same time, by 2 different officers. On the port side, Second Officer Littler read it as women and children only. And he held that line with iron rigidity, turning away men even when seats sat visibly empty, allowing exceptions only when a boat needed hands to row. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch read it as women and children first, and when no more women were in sight, he let men board. That single difference in interpretation, made under pressure with no time to confer, decided the fates of dozens of men purely according to which staircase they happened to climb. Survival that night was not only about who you were, it was about where you were standing. And where you were standing depended on your ticket. Here the story must go below decks. And it must go carefully, because myth has grown over this part like coral. Third-class passengers were not, on the evidence gathered by both investigations, held below by some single deliberate order. What the record shows is in some ways harder to accept. The barriers that existed, the ones connected to immigration and health inspection as much as to class. The sheer unfamiliar maze of a ship most of them had boarded 4 days earlier. Stewards with no rehearsed plan for guiding hundreds of people up from the lower decks. Language. In dozens of cases, no English at all. And families. Above all families. Refusing to split up. A first-class cabin sat 2 staircases from the boats. A family in the third class, sections forward, was half a mile of corridors, stairways, and wrong turns from the boat deck. In a ship, tilting further by the minute, some third-class men found their way up early and lived. Some groups were led up by individual stewards acting on their own initiative. Others reached the open decks only after the boats were gone. And some, witnesses testified, gathered in the stern and prayed. Consider what the geography meant for a family of 8. Moving that many people, including a child of 19 months, through unfamiliar passages and up several decks would have been slow under any circumstances. No surviving witness recorded how the Goodwins attempted it, or whether they ever reached an open deck at all. The record preserves only the outcome, and the outcome will wait for a later chapter. While all this unfolded, the ship performed its strangest scene. The orchestra, 8 musicians under bandmaster Wallace Hartley, assembled and played ragtime and waltzes, bright music, first in the lounge and then on the open deck. For hours, survivors disagreed about many things that night. Nearly all of them remembered the music. Whether it calmed people or simply made the scene more unreal, it remains one of the most documented acts of collective composure in modern history. All 8 played on. None survived. The individual choices made in those 90 minutes have become part of the moral vocabulary of the West, and the best attested of them deserve their place. Ida Strauss was offered a place in Boat 8 and refused it. Survivors heard her say that, after all their years together. Where her husband went, she would go. And witnesses saw the old couple settle into deck chairs. Side by side, Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet, by the account his steward carried to the family, changed into evening dress, saying they would go down like gentlemen. John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men alive, asked to join his pregnant 18-year-old wife in Boat 4, was refused by Lightoller, stepped back without argument, and was seen by witnesses standing quietly at the rail. Money bought a great deal in 1912, on the portside boat deck. For a man, it bought nothing at all. And Margaret Brown was rowing, put into Boat 6 almost bodily. She took an oar herself, organized the women around her, and by multiple accounts spent the hours that followed arguing with the boat's helmsman, Quartermaster Hitchens, demanding they turn back for swimmers. Most boats did not turn back, out of a fear, debated ever since, of being swamped by the drowning. Of the hundreds of people in the water after the sinking, only a handful were pulled into boats. That fact would sit in the survivors' consciences for the rest of their lives, and it belongs in the record. Then there is J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the line. Through the evening, witnesses placed him helping at the starboard boats, urging women in, sometimes so insistently that an officer snapped at him to stand clear. Near the end, at collapsible sea, with no women visible nearby and the boat about to go, Ismay stepped in and lived. Both investigations examined that step. The British one concluded that had he stayed, he would simply have added one more life to the lost. The public reached a different verdict, and we will come to it. But mark the contrast that history itself marked. Several of the richest men aboard stood back and died. The company's chairman sat down and lived. Fair or not, that single image would follow him to his grave. By 2 o'clock, the bow was under to the anchor cranes, the deck slanting steeply, the last collapsibles being cut loose as much as launched. The distribution was complete. Roughly 700 people sat in 20 boats on a flat, calm sea. Some 1,500 remained on the ship. And when the survival figures were later tallied by class, they formed the most quoted table in maritime history. In first class, roughly 6 in 10 lived. In second class, a little over 4 in 10. In third class, roughly 1 in 4. Among the crew, about the same or fewer, and the children, in first class. All but one of the children survived. In third class, taken as a group, most of the children died. Boys and girls, small enough to be carried, lost by the dozens. Because of where in the ship their parents could afford to sleep. No one ordered that outcome. That is the finding that should keep you up at night. It emerged from the gates and the geography, from 2 officers' readings of one phrase, from language and luck and architecture, from 1,000 small mechanisms, nobody designed for this purpose. A society does not need to decree who matters least. It can simply build itself, deck by deck, until the answer is structural. The people in the boats now drifted on black glass, watching a lit city tilt against the stars. They were not alone on that ocean, and they knew it, because for the past hour, Titanic had been calling into the night by wireless and by rocket. Who answered? Who came? And who saw and stayed where they were? That is the next part of the story. Chapter 9. Voices in the Night. While the boats loaded, a parallel drama ran in a room the size of a garden shed. The Marconi cabin, where Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the 2 young operators who had spent the evening clearing tourist telegrams, now conducted the first great distress traffic of the wireless age. What they did over the next 2 hours helped save every life that was saved. And around their signals hangs the darkest unresolved question of the entire story. Just after midnight, Captain Smith put his head into the cabin and told them to send the call for assistance. Phillips began hammering out CQD, the Marconi distress signal, followed by the ship's position as worked out by 4th Officer Boxhall. A little later, at Bride's half-joking suggestion, Phillips began mixing in the newer international signal, SOS, chosen by treaty not as an abbreviation of anything, but because its pattern was unmistakable. It was one of the early uses of SOS by a major liner in a real emergency. Though not, as legend insists, the first. The night sky over the North Atlantic, filled with invisible traffic. The Frankfurt answered. Position far off. Olympic answered. Titanic's own sister. Hundreds of miles away. Mount Temple. Baltic. Virginian. The calls crossed and tangled. And then, at about 12:25, an answer that mattered. The Cunard liner Carpathia, eastbound from New York toward the Mediterranean. Her operator, Harold Cottam, about to shut down for the night, caught the call almost by accident. He had stayed at his set a few minutes longer than duty required. On such threads, the count of the living would hang. Carpathia was about 58 miles away, 4 hours steaming at her ordinary best. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, is one of the heroes of this story. So meet him properly. Woken with the message, he ordered his ship turn toward the position before he had finished confirming what he had heard, then began issuing a stream of orders that his own crew recalled afterward with something like awe. Heat and hot water cut to the cabins, every ounce of steam sent to the engines. Doctors stationed in each dining saloon, rope ladders rigged, slings prepared for children, oil made ready to calm the sea alongside. Lookouts doubled and doubled again, because Carpathia was now driving at, and by some accounts beyond, her normal maximum speed, through the same darkness, toward the same ice field that had just mortally wounded the largest ship in the world. Rostron, a famously religious man, was seen on his bridge that night, by his officers later telling, with his hand raised in silent prayer. Whatever her exact speed through those hours, and analysts still argue the figure, his engineers gave him everything the ship had, and then something more. But 58 miles was 58 miles. And on Titanic's bridge, they could do that arithmetic instantly. The ship had perhaps 2 hours. Carpathia needed closer to 4, which is why what Boxhall saw from the bridge wing mattered so much. A light, low on the horizon, off the port bow, a few miles distant. What he judged under oath to be the masthead lights, and then the red side light of a steamer, close enough that Smith ordered him to signal her. Boxhall fired distress rockets, 8 of them across the next hour or so, white bursts high over the sea, and worked a Morse signal lamp toward the stranger. The light did not answer. At some point, he testified, it seemed slowly to turn away. Now cross the dark water. 10 miles or 20. The exact distance is itself part of the dispute. To the small steamer Californian, stopped for the night at the edge of the ice field. The same ship whose warning Phillips had brushed aside hours earlier. Her wireless operator, her only one, was asleep, his set switched off, on her bridge through the small hours. Her officers watched the lights of a large steamer stopped in the distance. And between roughly midnight and 2 in the morning, her second officer and an apprentice saw, and counted, 8 white rockets rising from that direction. They reported the rockets down the voice tube to Captain Stanley Lord, who had turned in, dressed. In the chart room, what exactly was said, and what Lord absorbed through sleep, was contested to the end of every participant's life. The Californian tried her own Morse lamp at the distant ship and got nothing she recognized as a reply. What she did not do, and this is testified by her own officers, is wake the wireless man, a turn of a switch that would have filled her headphones with the position of a sinking liner. She made no effective response at all. Her engines stayed stopped until morning. By then, the sea to the south held only boats, and the dead. Both the American and British investigations concluded that the ship seen from Titanic was the Californian, that she saw Titanic's rockets, and that she might have pushed through the ice to the scene. The British report going so far as to say she might thus have saved many, if not all, of the lives that were lost. Captain Lord disputed that finding for the rest of his days, and a body of defenders, active to this day, argues that distances do not match, that a third unidentified vessel may have lain between the 2 ships, that the positions in evidence never line up cleanly. In 1992, after the discovered wreck site proved Boxhall's calculated position had been miles off, the British government re-examined the case. That reassessment still concluded the rockets seen from the Californian were Titanic's, while allowing that even a prompt response might not have arrived before the sinking. This story will not pretend the file is closed. What can be said plainly is this. A ship lay within sight of 8 white rockets on a freezing night. Her captain was told of them, and she stayed where she was, while some 1,500 people died over the horizon. Whatever the charts finally prove, that stands back in the Marconi cabin. The water was climbing, and the power was sagging. Smith came to the door a final time and released the operators, telling them, by Bride's account, that they had done their full duty, and it was every man for himself now. Phillips kept sending. His signals went out ragged as the dynamos faltered. Past 2 in the morning, growing weaker, then stopping. Bride survived the sinking, washed off the ship alongside a capsized, collapsible. Phillips did not. He was 25 years old, and the traffic he sent in his last 2 hours brought Carpathia, and every one of the roughly 700, to the same small patch of ocean. Out in the boats, the rowers had stopped watching the horizon for the stranger's light. They were watching the ship. Her bow was gone now, her forward funnel nearing the water, her lights still burning in long rows. The people in the boats, the people soon to be in the water, and the people still aboard were about to share the same few minutes. Chapter 10, 2:20. The ship breaks. The last minutes of Titanic's life were witnessed by roughly 700 people in boats, by the swimmers who lived, and by no camera of any kind. Everything we know comes from human memory, taken down under oath within weeks. And human memory, as this chapter will show, turned out to be both better and worse than anyone believed. Better, because the ordinary witnesses were right. Worse, because it took 73 years for the record to catch up with them. Picture the ship as Boat 6 or Boat 13 saw her, from a few hundred yards out on water, so still it mirrored her lights. The bow buried, the sea rolling quietly along the forward decks and rising, the stern lifting, slowly at first, the three enormous propellers coming up out of the water into the starlight. And she was loud now, everything not bolted down inside her. Pianos, furniture, machinery tearing loose from its beds, thousands of tons of it, began to slide and smash forward. A roar, survivors, compared to rolling thunder, that would not stop. On the decks, the last acts were compressed into minutes. The final collapsibles were cut free rather than launched. One floating away, upside down. Light-Toller, having sent off the last boat he could, dove from the roof of the officers' quarters and was sucked against a ventilator grate by inrushing water, held there against the drowning ship, until a blast of warm air from somewhere below blew him clear. An escape he described under oath and barely believed himself. Two men who have been with this story since Belfast were somewhere in those final minutes. And both of them belong here, told at exactly the confidence the evidence allows. Thomas Andrews, the man who knew every rivet of her, was last reliably reported earlier in the sinking, urging passengers into boats and telling people to put on their lifebelts. A steward's much-repeated account placed him later in the first-class smoking room, alone, standing before the painting above the fireplace, his life belt off, apparently past hoping. That image has become part of the legend, and it may be true, but it rests on a single recollection given afterward, and no one saw the end of him. Thomas Andrews was 39. His body was never recovered. Of the 8 who died, building her in Belfast, and the designer who sailed with her, not one lived to see the ship complete a single crossing. And Captain Edward John Smith, he is one of the most searched-for figures of the entire night. And the honest answer is that nobody knows. Witnesses placed him on the bridge, in the water, swimming toward a collapsible with a child in his arms, telling his crew to be British, shooting himself. These accounts contradict each other. Most surfaced days or weeks later in newspapers, and neither investigation could establish what happened to him. What is certain is that he did not survive, that he was last seen at or near his bridge as the sea took it, and that a career of 40 years and 1,000,000 safe miles ended within sight of the sentence he had given a reporter 5 years earlier, that he could not imagine any condition causing a modern ship to founder. He was proved wrong in the most public way any professional has ever been proved wrong, and he did not outlive the proof. Somewhere aft, the 8 musicians finally lowered their instruments. What they played last became legend almost immediately. The hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee." The record deserves better than the legend. So here it is, honestly. Some survivors did report a hymn near the end. Harold Bride, aboard nearly to the last, testified the final tune was a piece he knew as Autumn. Witnesses in distant boats, over the noise of a dying ship, could not agree, and never would. What no witness disputed was that the music had gone on almost to the water's edge. At about 2:17, the lights that had burned in perfect rows through the entire disaster kept alive by the engineering staff working below in the flooding ship, flickered once, came back, and went out forever. Not one of Titanic's engineering officers survived. The ship became a black silhouette against the stars, her stern climbing until, to witnesses in the boats, it seemed to stand almost perpendicular, hanging there. Some said, for the better part of a minute, and then the ship did something the official conclusion would get wrong for 73 years. She broke. Dozens of survivors described it. A rending, cracking roar. The forward funnel had already torn loose and fallen among the swimmers. Now, witnesses in the nearest boats said, the hull fractured aft of amidships, between the third and fourth funnels, the stern settling back toward level for a moment, as if reprieved, before rising again, pivoting, and beginning its final slide. 17-year-old Jack Thayer, in the freezing water yards away, described the breakup in detail, and a fellow survivor aboard Carpathia sketched it from his account days later, drawings that were printed and then set aside, because, at both investigations, the senior surviving officers, Lightoller foremost, testified that the ship sank intact, in one piece. Faced with flatly contradictory testimony about events in near-total darkness, the British inquiry gave greater weight to the professional seaman, and the intact sinking became the official version, repeated in books and films for 7 decades, while the passengers and stokers who had said otherwise lived out their lives formerly mistaken. At 2:20 in the morning, ship's time, on Monday the 15th of April, 1912, the stern of Titanic slid under. From the sighting of the Iceberg to this moment, 2 hours and 40 minutes had passed. What followed was, by every survivor account, the worst part of the night, and this story will not look away from it, though it will not linger either. Roughly 1,500 people were now in water of about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, most of them in lifebelts, alive, and calling for help. Survivors in the boats, hundreds of yards off, described the sound as one continuous cry, like a vast crowd heard from a distance, and said it faded slowly, over perhaps 20 minutes to 40, as the cold did its work. In water that temperature, unconsciousness overtakes most people within about 15 to 30 minutes. The lifebelts kept the dead afloat. The boats, most of them standing off out of fear of being swamped, took in only a handful of swimmers. Boat 4, closest in, pulled several from the sea, and one boat went back. 5th Officer Harold Lowe gathered several boats together, transferred his passengers among them, took a volunteer crew, and rowed into the wreckage. By the time he judged it safe to go in, the cries had nearly stopped. He found 4 men alive among the floating dead. 1 died before morning. Lowe's return is remembered as heroism, and it recovered 4 people out of 1,500. That arithmetic is the night's final verdict on the 20 boats. 2 images close this chapter, both sworn to. Chief Baker, Charles Jockin, who had spent the sinking throwing deck chairs overboard as flotation for others, and drinking, rowed the stern down as the ship went under, stepping into the sea, by his own account, without even wetting his hair, and was pulled alive onto a boat around dawn. How he endured is genuinely unresolved. The drink in him has passed into folklore as the explanation, but physiology points the other way, since alcohol tends to increase the body's heat loss, and his survival is better filed under the unexplained. And on the upturned collapsible B, some 30 men stood balanced in the dark, Lightoller among them, Bride among them, Jack Thayer among them, shifting their weight in unison against the swell. keeping a capsized boat level until dawn, while around them, the sea went silent. The North Atlantic, at 3 a.m. on the 15th of April, held 20 boats, roughly 700 living people, a field of the floating dead, and no ship. 50 miles off, one small Cunard liner was still driving through the ice by starlight. Chapter 11. Carpathia and the Longest Morning. Dawn on the North Atlantic comes slowly in April, grey before gold. To the people in the boats, that particular dawn revealed two things at once. The first was the ice. Daylight showed what the night had hidden. Bergs on every horizon, some towering, and a great white field of pack ice stretching miles. The trap they had steamed into fully visible, only now that it had sprung. The second thing they saw was a steamer, hull up, over the horizon, to the southeast. Rockets firing to announce herself. Carpathia had arrived. Rostron had driven his ship through the night past berg after berg. His extra lookouts spotting, each with minutes to spare, dodging at a pace his vessel was never certified to make. He reached the transmitted distress position around 4 a.m. and found nothing. No ship. No boats. Because the ship was gone, and the position Boxhall had calculated under pressure was, as the wreck's location would prove decades later, miles off. Then, a green flare burned low on the water. Boxhall, in Boat 2, had been lighting signals through the small hours. At about 4:10, Boat 2 came alongside, and the first survivors climbed Carpathia's ladders. Rostron leaned down and asked Boxhall the question to which he already knew the answer, and Boxhall gave it to him plainly. The ship had gone down at about 2:20. For the next 4 hours, boats straggled in across the ice, scattered water, and the scenes on Carpathia's decks entered the memory of everyone who saw them. Women pressed against the rails, scanning each incoming boat for husbands who were not in it. Children hauled up in mail sacks and slings. The rescued standing, wordless, wrapped in blankets, staring at nothing. Carpathia's own passengers gave up cabins, clothes, and toothbrushes. By about 8:30, the last boat, Lightollah's overloaded number 12, came alongside, and Lightoller himself, by his own account and long tradition, was the last survivor to step aboard. The count of the saved stood at roughly 700, a shade over that figure by every official tally, though the British and American numbers disagree by a handful. One more reminder that even the arithmetic of this disaster was never perfectly settled. Against them stood some 1,500 lost. Rostron did 2 more things before leaving that place, and both tell you who he was. He steamed slowly across the site of the sinking. Wreckage and the accounts are unsparing. Bodies in lifebelts drifting past his rails. To be certain, no living person remained, and he called the survivors and his own company to a service in the main saloon. Part thanksgiving for the saved, part funeral for the sea around them. Then he turned Carpathia west for New York. 3 days away, through fog and rough weather nearly the whole run. Those 3 days became one of the strangest information vacuums of the modern age. The world knew by Monday that Titanic had struck ice, because her distress calls had been overheard up and down the Atlantic and relayed ashore. What the world did not know was the outcome, and into that vacuum poured wishful fiction. Early bulletins and headlines in respected papers reported that all passengers were saved, that the ship was being towed to Halifax, that other liners had taken everyone off. White Star's New York office, through its vice president Philip Franklin, assured the press through Monday that the ship was unsinkable and her people safe. In good faith, on the information he had, which was almost none. That evening, Confirmation of the true toll reached him, and reporters described Franklin breaking down as he faced them. The lesson was not lost on anyone in the newspaper trade. In the new wireless age, news could outrun truth by a full day, and the vacuum would always be filled by hope, rumor, or invention. If that dynamic sounds familiar to a modern audience, it should. Aboard Carpathia, meanwhile, Harold Bride, frostbitten feet and all, was carried to the wireless cabin to help the exhausted Cottam work the traffic. Hundreds of survivor names spelled out letter by letter to shore stations, and one message stream that would become notorious. J. Bruce Ismay. Shattered, confined to a doctor's cabin for most of the voyage by the accounts of those aboard. Sent wires ahead, arranging to hold a White Star liner so that he and the surviving crew could be returned promptly to England. To Ismay, it was logistics. To the American press, and to a United States Senator named William Alden Smith reading the intercepted traffic, it looked like an attempt to put the witnesses beyond the reach of American questions. The senator began drafting subpoenas. On the evening of Thursday, the 18th of April, Carpathia came up, New York Harbor in rain and lightning. Past crowds reported in the tens of thousands lining the battery and the waterfront. She did not go first to her own berth. In a gesture, the crowd understood at once. She steamed to the White Star piers, and there lowered Titanic's recovered lifeboats, the only pieces of the ship that would ever complete the crossing, before proceeding to her own pier and putting the survivors ashore into the flash of press cameras and the arms of families, or into the silence of no one waiting. Far behind her, other ships were doing the work, nobody photographed for the front pages. The cable ship, Mackay Bennett, chartered out of Halifax with a hold full of ice, embalming supplies, and coffins, spent days recovering the drifting dead. She alone recovered around 300, and the vessels that followed raised the total recovered to more than 330. Out of some 1,500 lost, identification was by effects. Letters, tattoos, a ticket stub, many, badly damaged by the sea or unidentifiable, were buried at sea. About 150 were laid in Halifax cemeteries, where rows of small grey stones stand to this day. Some named, many marked only with a number and the date. One of those, the Mackay Bennett, lifted from the water, was a small, fair-haired boy, well under 2 years old. No relative claimed him. The crew of the Mackay Bennett, hard men doing the hardest work of their lives, paid from their own pockets for his burial and his monument in Halifax, a stone dedicated to an unknown child. And for nearly a century, that is what he remained. Then, in the 2000s, researchers using DNA from the grave and from living relatives put his name back. He was Sidney Goodwin, 19 months old, the youngest of the family from Fulham, bound for a house near Niagara Falls. Frederick, Augusta, Lillian, Charles, William, Jesse, Harold, Sidney. All 8 Goodwins died. Sidney is the only one the sea gave back. The sea had given its answer. Now came the land's turn to demand one. Waiting on that New York pier among the families stood Senator Smith with his subpoenas. And across the ocean, the British Board of Trade was convening its own tribunal. 2 nations were about to examine the same catastrophe, ask very different questions, and change the rules of the sea forever. Chapter 12. 2 Inquiries and the Price of the Lesson. The morning after Carpathia docked, before most survivors had slept a full night on land, the questioning began. Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan opened his hearings in a ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York on Friday the 19th of April. And his first witness, was J. Bruce Ismay. The speed was the point. Smith had boarded Carpathia at the pier with subpoenas in hand precisely so that no British witness could sail for home before America had its answers. The two inquiries that followed, the Senate investigation in America and the Board of Trade inquiry under Lord Mersey in Britain, examined the same night and became, in themselves, a study in how two nations think. The American hearings were raw, democratic, and technically naive, and the naivety turned out to be their power. Senator Smith was a lawyer from the Midwest, not a seaman, and the British press mocked him without mercy. Above all, for the moment, he asked Fifth Officer Lowe what an iceberg was composed of. Ice, Lowe answered, and London howled for a week. But because Smith did not know what every professional took for granted, he asked the questions professionals never would. Why were there boats for barely half the people aboard? Why was the ship at full speed in a region she had been warned about? Why did third class die at a rate so far beyond first? Who, exactly, decided anything? Over 18 days and 82 witnesses, officers, stewards, lookouts, millionaire, and stokers answered to a nation, in plain language, on the record, when Smith asked Lightoller whether he had left the ship or the ship had left him, and Lightoller answered that the ship had left him. The room got a sentence no technical expert would ever have produced. That transcript remains one of the great primary documents of the 20th century. And it exists because a man, the experts laughed at, refused to be embarrassed out of asking. The British inquiry, which ran through May and June of 1912, was the opposite instrument, technical, lawyerly, and exhaustive, with naval architects, model tests, and nearly 100 witnesses. It produced the most detailed reconstruction of the sinking then possible. It also produced conclusions that have been argued about ever since. Captain Smith, it found, had made a grievous mistake in maintaining speed, but had only done what every experienced master of the era did, and so was not negligent. The Board of Trade, whose own outdated rules had made 20 boats legal, was examined by a tribunal the board itself had appointed, and emerged with gentle criticism, an arrangement that raised eyebrows then and has raised them ever since. Captain Lord of the Californian was condemned in the report's findings, yet never formally charged with any offence. An ambiguity that kept the controversy alive for the rest of the century. And Ismay was cleared of wrongdoing in both countries. The American report spread the moral responsibility across an entire system. The British report found, in effect, that the system itself had been the defendant, and a system cannot be jailed. The public held its own court, and it was not gentle. The American press turned on Ismay with a ferocity that no official finding could soften. His name, in the most repeated version of the story, was said to have been rendered in print as J. Brute Ismay, and the cartoons were crueler than the nickname. The man who had stepped into collapsible sea in the final minutes, into a place the British inquiry concluded would otherwise have gone empty, became the era's symbol of privilege, saving itself while women drowned. Was that fair? You have seen the evidence this story could gather. And the honest answer is that reasonable people have disagreed for over a century. What is fact is what followed. Ismay stepped down from the presidency of the Shipping Trust and the chairmanship of White Star the following year, withdrew for long stretches to a fishing lodge in the west of Ireland, and lived quietly until his death in 1937. Those who knew him said the 15th of April never left him. Of all the men who did not drown that night, he may have paid the longest price for surviving. But the true legacy of the two inquiries is not in the reputations they made or broke. It is in the rules. Because this is where 1,500 deaths began, saving lives. And they have never stopped. The changes came in a wave. Lifeboat capacity sufficient for everyone aboard became the demanded standard for passenger ships. With drills, actual drills, required and recorded, wireless, manned around the clock on passenger vessels, written into American law within months and spreading into international practice, so that no rescue would ever again depend on whether one exhausted operator stayed up a few minutes past his shift. Shipping lanes shifted south, away from the ice, and in November of 1913, delegations from the maritime nations met in London and produced the first international convention for the safety of life at sea, signed in 1914 and known ever since by its initials as SOLAS, covering hulls, boats, wireless, and ice. That convention, revised again and again across a century, still governs every large ship on Earth today. Every passenger who has ever yawned through a lifeboat drill on a cruise ship is standing inside Titanic's legacy without knowing it. The ice itself got a permanent watch. American vessels began patrolling the ice lanes within weeks of the disaster. The work passed to the Revenue Cutter Service the following year, and the 1914 convention placed it on an international footing as the International Ice Patrol, operated by the United States Coast Guard and funded by the maritime nations whose ships it protects. It has kept that watch every ice season since, first by ship, then by aircraft. Now, with satellite support, it also returns to the wreck site for memorial observances, lowering wreaths onto the grey water above her. The palace was gone. The inquiries were over. The rules were rewritten, and the century moved on into wars that dwarfed the death toll of any shipwreck. The survivors aged, gave interviews or refused them, and one by one departed. The ship herself lay in a darkness no technology could reach, at a depth beyond any diver, her exact position unknown, because the distress coordinates, as the empty sea at 4 a.m. had already hinted to Rostron, were miles wrong. For 73 years, Titanic existed only in memory, and memory, as the official verdict of a ship sinking in one piece had proven, could be wrong at the highest levels while being right in the cheap seats. Then, in the summer of 1985, a camera sled flying through the blackness 2.5 miles down stopped transmitting empty sand and started transmitting a boiler. Chapter 13. The Wreck, the Myth, and What Sank That Night. The expedition that found Titanic began with a mission the public was not allowed to know about. In the late summer of 1985, Robert Ballard was at sea on a joint French and American effort. And, as he revealed years later, his time out there was partly funded by the United States Navy for a classified assignment, surveying the wrecks of 2 lost nuclear submarines, Thresher and Scorpion. Titanic was both the public face of the voyage and the reward. The search he was allowed to run with whatever days remained. He had 12 of them. His French partners, led by Jean-Louis Michel of the Ocean Research Institute, IFRAMA, had spent weeks sweeping the search area with sonar and finding nothing. Ballard's team tried a different logic. Do not look for the ship. Look for what fell out of her. A sinking ship scatters a trail of debris down the current as it goes, a plume stretching far across the seafloor. Much easier to cross with a camera than one hull in an underwater mountain range. Late on the 31st of August, the camera sled Argo, towed by the research vessel Nor, flew over a seabed that suddenly stopped being empty. Wreckage. Fragments. Then, in the small hours of the 1st of September, unmistakable on the monitors, one of the 29 boilers. Its riveted face, identical to the photographs from Belfast, The control room erupted, and then, by Ballard's own account, someone noticed how close the clock stood to the hour the ship had gone down, and the celebration stopped. The team gathered on the fantail for a few quiet minutes in memory of the dead below. Then they went back to work, because they had found more than a wreck. They had found the answer sheet to 73 years of argument. The ship lay in two pieces, bow and stern, roughly 2,000 feet apart, facing different directions. More than a third of a mile of open seafloor between the halves of a ship, the official conclusion said, had sunk whole. The passengers, the stokers, the teenager treading freezing water, they had been right all along. The professionals, and the finding, built on their testimony, had been wrong. She broke on the surface. The stern, torn open and imploded on the way down, lay mangled almost beyond recognition. The bow, which had flooded before separating and descended largely intact, had planed down and buried itself deep into the sediment. Upright, recognizable, her railings draped in hanging formations of rust that scientists would name rusticles. The work of iron-eating microbes slowly consuming the hull, and scattered between and around the two halves lay the debris field. Thousands of objects, wine bottles, bathtubs, floor tiles, a doll's head, and pairs of shoes lying together on the sand. Twos up, where a person had come to rest, and everything but the leather had returned to the sea. The discovery settled old questions and opened new ones. Later expeditions, probing the buried starboard bow with sonar, found no 300-foot gash, and instead found evidence consistent with the narrow, intermittent openings that Edward Wilding had calculated from the flooding evidence back in 1912. About 12 square feet of total wound, distributed with perfect fatality. The forgotten engineer had been right within weeks of the sinking. Metallurgical studies of recovered steel and rivets suggested the materials, sound practice by the standards of their day, behaved brittly in ice-cold water, with some research pointing at slag content in the hand-driven wrought iron rivets of the bow. Findings associated with the work of researchers, including Jennifer Hooper McCarty and Tim Foakey, and still debated in degree. Nothing found on the bottom convicted anyone. Everything found on the bottom confirmed the deeper verdict. She was built honestly, to the best standards of her time, by people who could not imagine the one night she actually met. Then the bottom of the sea became a battlefield of its own. Ballard took nothing, and has argued ever since that the site is a grave and should be left in peace. A salvage company, holder of the legal rights, has since recovered thousands of artifacts for conservation and exhibition. Watches stopped in the small hours, a leather satchel of letters, perfume vials that still held their scent. Millions of people have stood in front of those objects. The two positions, memorial and museum, rescue and robbery, depending on who is speaking, have contested each other in courtrooms and editorials for decades. And this story takes no side beyond noting one fact on which everyone agrees. The hull is losing its long argument with the microbes. Expeditions across recent decades have documented accelerating collapse. The crow's nest gone. Sections of the officers' quarters fallen in. No one can date the end with confidence. But more of the recognizable ship will go, year over year, until the sea finishes what it started. The witnesses are already gone. The last survivors died across the 1990s and 2000s, and the very last of all, Milvina Dean, who had been carried aboard as a 2-month-old baby in 3rd class, died in 2009. At 97, her ashes were scattered at Southampton, at the docks her ship sailed from. So end where this story began, with the question underneath all of it: Why this ship? The 20th century drowned its millions in wars and famines. Greater tonnage has gone down. More souls have been lost on other waters. Yet, it is this one night, 2 hours and 40 minutes in April of 1912, that the world cannot stop retelling. The films, the books, the exhibitions, the arguments, a century of them, all orbiting one hull. Here is the answer this story has argued from its first chapter. Titanic endures because she was not just a ship that sank. She was a civilization in miniature, arranged deck by deck, exactly as that civilization arranged itself. And in a single night, she tested every one of its beliefs. With the lights on, the belief that technology had conquered nature, the belief that wealth was safety, the belief that rules written in calm weather would hold in catastrophe. Some people aboard met that test with a grace that still stops the heart. The engineers who kept the lights burning, the musicians, the old couple in the deck chairs, a captain of a small Cunard liner driving his ship through the ice toward strangers. Some failed it, and some, like 8 members of one family from Fulham, were simply failed by it and never got a vote at all. What sank at 2:20 in the morning on the 15th of April, 1912, was a ship. What sank with her was a certainty. The calm confidence of an age that believed progress itself was a form of protection. The world that woke on the 16th of April is, in that one respect, the world we still live in. It builds magnificent things, and it knows, in a way, it can never again unknow, that magnificence is not the same as safety. That is what the boats are for. 2.5 miles down, the bow still faces west, toward New York, as if the crossing were merely paused. The ice still comes down the Labrador Current every spring, and above her, from time to time, a wreath goes down onto the grey water. She was called unsinkable by people who never built her. Her real name was on her stern all along. Titanic, from an old story about giants who believed they could not fall. They fell,